Eduardo Galeano, Open Veins of Latin America. The Rubber Cycle. Caruso inaugurates a jungle theater. Some authors estimate that in the period of the rise of rubber, no less than 500,000 Northeasterners succumbed to epidemics, malaria, tuberculosis, or beriberi, says one. This grim charnel house was the price of the rubber industry. Peasants with no nutritional reserves went from the dry lands to the swampy jungle where fevers lay in wait for them. Packed into ships' holds for the long journey, many anticipated their fate by dying en route. Others did not even reach the ships. In 1878, 120,000 of Cearà's 800,000 population headed for the Amazon, and less than half got there. The rest collapsed from hunger or disease on the Sertão trails or in the suburbs of Fortaleza. A year earlier, one of the Northeast's 7 greatest droughts of the past century had begun. Not only fevers awaited them in the jungle, but a work regime very similar to slavery. Guardias rurales posted along the riverbank shot at fugitives. The pay was in kind: dried meat, manioc flour, lumps of unrefined sugar. Aguardiente. Until the rubber worker paid off his debts, a miracle that rarely occurred. Employers had an agreement among themselves not to give jobs to workers who were in debt to other employers. Debts piled on debts. The cost of transport from the Northeast were added the debts for work tools, machetes, knives, and eating bowls. And since the worker consumed food and above all liquor, never a scarce commodity in the rubber forest, the longer he worked, the higher his accumulated debt. The illiterate Northeasterners were at the mercy of the administrators, conjuring tricks with the ledgers. In 1770, J.B. Priestley had observed that rubber would erase pencil marks on paper, and 70 years later, Charles Goodyear and the Englishman Thomas Hancock simultaneously discovered the process of vulcanizing rubber, making it flexible and impervious to temperature changes. In 1850, the wheels of vehicles were being sheathed in rubber. At the end of the century, the automobile industry was born in the United States and Europe, and with it the consumption of great quantities of pneumatic tires. World demand for rubber soared. The rubber tree was bringing Brazil a tenth of its export income in 1890, and by 1910 this had risen to 40%, making rubber sales almost equal to those of coffee, although coffee was then at the height of its prosperity. Most of the rubber production came from the Acre area, which Brazil had wrested from Bolivia after a lightning military campaign. Some 75,000 square miles were lopped off Bolivia. In 1902, it got 2 million pounds indemnity and a railway line giving it access to the Madeira and Amazon rivers. With Acre in its possession, Brazil had almost all of the world's rubber reserves. Prices were at their peak on the international market, and it seemed that good times had come to stay. The rubber workers, of course, did not share in this, although it was they who went out from their huts each dawn, receptacles strapped on their backs to bleed the giant Hevea brasiliensis trees. They made incisions in the trunks and in thick branches, and the whitish, sticky latex dripped from the wounds, filling the cups in a couple of hours. At night, the flat slabs of rubber which had accumulated in the administration center were cooked. The sour and revolting smell of rubber impregnated the city of Manaus, world capital of the rubber business. Manaus had 5,000 inhabitants in 1849. It had 70,000 in little more than half a century. Their rubber magnates built their extravagantly designed and sumptuously decorated mansions with precious oriental woods, Portuguese majolicas, columns of Carrara marble, and furniture by French master cabinet makers. The Nouveau Riche of the jungle had the most costly foods brought from Rio de Janeiro. Europe's top courtiers cut their dresses and outfits. They sent their sons to study at British schools. The Amazonas Theatre, a Baroque monument in triumphantly poor taste, is the chief symbol of that vertigo of wealth at the beginning of our century. Caruso navigated the river through the jungle to sing to Manu's inhabitants for a kingly fee on opening night. Pavlova, who was supposed to dance there, could not get beyond Bellum, but sent her apologies. In 1913, sudden disaster hit Brazilian rubber. The world price fell to a quarter of the 2 shillings it had been 3 years earlier. The Far East had only exported 4 tons of rubber in 1900. In 1914, Ceylonese and Malay plantations poured over 70,000 tons onto the world market, and within 5 years their exports approached the 400,000 ton mark. By 1919, Brazil had a virtual monopoly, was supplying only 1/8 of world consumption. A half century later, Brazil is buying more than half its rubber from abroad. What happened? Back in 1873, Henry Wickham, an Englishman who owned rubber forests on the Rio Tapajos and was known for his botanical manias, had sent sketches and leaves of the rubber tree to the director of Kew Gardens in London. He got an order for a quantity of seeds from the yellow fruit of Hevea brasiliensis. Since Brazil severely punished any leakage of seeds, he had to smuggle them out, which was not easy. Ships were meticulously searched by the authorities. Then, as if under a magic spell, an Inman line ship penetrated 1,200 miles further than usual into the interior of Brazil. On its return, Henry Wickham was aboard as a member of the crew. He had selected the best seeds after putting the fruit out to dry in a native village, and had put them in a locked cabin, wrapped in banana leaves and suspended on strings so that the ship's rats could not eat them. The rest of the ship was empty. In the port of Bellum, at the river's mouth, Wickham invited the authorities to a grand banquet. The Englishman's eccentricities were notorious. All Amazonia knew that he collected orchids, and he explained that on order from the English king he was carrying a collection of rare orchid bulbs to Kew Gardens. As the plants were very delicate, he had them in a hermetically sealed cabin at a special temperature. If it was open, the flowers would be ruined. Thus the seeds reached the Liverpool docks unscathed. 40 years later, the British invaded the world market with Malayan rubber. The Asian plantations, skillfully developed from shoots grown at Kew Gardens, easily supplanted Brazilian production. Amazonian prosperity vanished in a puff of smoke. The jungle closed back upon itself. Fortune hunters left for other parts, and the luxurious camp disintegrated. The only people remaining, surviving as best they could, were the workers who had been brought from afar to make fortunes for others, and not even for Brazilians. For Brazil had merely responded to the siren song of world demand for raw materials, without itself participating in the real business of rubber, finance, trade, industrialization, and distribution. The siren fell mute until World War II gave a new but fleeting push to Amazonian rubber. The Allied powers desperately searched for supplies when the Japanese occupied Malaya. The Peruvian jungle was ransacked, and the so called Battle of Rubber once again mobilized Brazil's northeastern peasants. Early in our century, rubber forested mountains in Peru had held out the promise of a new El Dorado. In 1908, Francisco Garcia Calderon wrote in El Peru Contemporáneo that rubber was the great wealth of the future. In his novel The Greenhouse, Mario Vargas Llosa reconstructs the feverish atmosphere in Iquitos and in the jungle where adventurers robbed the Indians and each other. Nature had leprosy and other weapons with which to take its vengeance. This time, according to an accusation made in the Congress when the battle ended, the victims of disease and hunger whose bodies remained to rot among the rubber trees numbered some 50,000. The rubber boom and the rise of coffee growing involved big levies of northeastern workers, but the government also uses its bottomless reserve of cheap labor for public works. The naked men who built the city of Brasilia almost overnight were northeasterners transported like cattle to the wilderness site. Today, this most modern of the world's cities is surrounded by a great belt of poverty. When they finished their work, these people, known as candangos, were dumped in outlying hovels. They are always available for any task. 300,000 Northeasterners live off the splendid capital's leavings. The Northeasterners' slave labor is now constructing the great Trans-Amazonia highway that will cut Brazil in two, penetrating the jungle up to the Bolivian border. The March to the West, as the plan is called, also involves an agricultural colonialization project to extend the frontiers of civilization. Each peasant will get 10 hectares of land if he survives the tropical fevers. The Northeast contains 6 million landless peasants, while 15,000 people own half of all the land. Agrarian reform is not carried out in the already occupied areas where the latifundistas' property rights remain sacred, but in the jungle. Thus, a road for the latifundios' expansion into new territories being opened up by its victims, the flagellado or tormented ones of the Northeast. Without capital or implements, what is the use of 10 hectares 1 to 2,000 miles from consumer centers? One must conclude that the government's real aims are quite different. To provide labor for the U.S. government's real aim, U.S. latifundistas who have bought or appropriated half the lands north of the Rio Negro, and also for U.S. Steel, which received Amazonia's rich iron and manganese deposits from General Garrastazu Medici. Cocoa planters lit their cigarettes with 500,000 rice bills. For a long time, Venezuela had identified with cocoa, a native South American plant. Venezuelans, as Domingo Rangel says, have been made to sell cocoa and distribute foreign trinkets in their own lands. The cocoa oligarchs made up a holy trinity of backwardness, along with moneylenders and traders. Cocoa coexisted with indigo, sugar, tobacco, and a few mines and cattle raising on the plains, but the people correctly baptized as Gran Coco, the slave-owning oligarchy in Caracas, which supplied cocoa to Mexico's mining oligarchy and to the Spanish metropolis, thus using black labor to enrich itself. A coffee era began in Venezuela in 1873. Coffee, like cocoa, needs sloping lands or warm valleys. Despite this competition, cocoa continued to expand, invading the humid lands of Carúpano. Carpano. Venezuela remained an agricultural country condemned to the cyclical rise and fall of coffee and cocoa prices. The two products created the capital that enabled landlords, merchants, and moneylenders to live as wasteful parasites. Then in 1922, the country suddenly became a fountain of oil, and oil has reigned without interruption ever since. The black gold finally gushed forth, justifying 4 centuries late the fantasies of the Spanish conquistadors, searching in vain for the king who bathed in gold. They had become mad enough to confuse a little Maracaibo village with Venice, and the fetid coast of Paria with earthly paradise. The last decades of the 19th century marked the rise of European and U.S. gluttony for chocolate. The industry's progress lent great impetus to Brazilian cocoa and to production in the old Venezuelan and Ecuadorian plantations. Cocoa made its entrance onto the Brazilian economic stage at the same time as rubber, and like rubber, it gave work to northeastern peasants. Sao Salvador, now Bahia, on Todos os Santos Bay, once capital of Brazil and of sugar, and one of Latin America's most important cities, revived as cocoa capital in our time. Latifundio, south of Bahia, from the Reconcavo region to the state of Espirito Santo, between the littoral lowlands and the mountain chain along the coast, still supply raw material for a good part of the world's chocolate consumption. Like sugarcane, cocoa means monoculture, the burning of forests, the dictatorship of international prices, the perpetual penury for the workers. The plantation owners who live on the Rio de Janeiro beaches and are more businessmen than farmers do not permit a single inch of land to be devoted to other crops. Their managers normally pay wages in kind, jerk beef, flour, beans. When paid in cash, the peasant receives the equivalent of a liter of beer for a whole day's work and must work a day and a half to buy a can of powdered milk. For some time, Brazil was favored in the international market, but from the onset, Africa offered serious competition. By the 1920s, the Gold Coast, now Ghana, had won the top position as the world cocoa supplier. The British had developed cacao plantations in their colony on a large scale with modern methods. Brazil fell back to second place and years later to third, but there was more than one period when no one would have believed that the fertile lands of southern Bahia were destined for mediocrity. Unused throughout the colonial period, the soil yielded prodigally. Peons split the pods with their knives, collected the beans, and loaded them into donkey-drawn carts to be taken to the grinders. It became necessary to fell ever more forests, to open up new clearings and conquer new territory with machete and gun. The peons knew nothing of prices or markets. They did not even know who ruled Brazil. Up until not long ago, one could still meet hacienda workers who were convinced that King Pedro II was still on the throne. The cacao masters rubbed their hands together. They knew, or thought they knew, chocolate consumption grew, and with its prices and profits, the port of Ilhéus, from which almost all the cacao was shipped, became known as Queen of the South. And although it is languishing today, the small but massive palaces which the haciendados furnished with the greatest luxury and the worst taste may still be seen there. Jorge Amado wrote several novels about it. He recreates one of the high-priced periods, thus: Ilhéus and the cacao zone swam in gold, bathed in champagne, slept with French ladies from Rio de Janeiro at the Trianon, the city's most chic cabaret. Colonel Maneka Dantas lit cigarettes with 500,000 rice bills, repeating the gesture of all the country's rich fazenderos during the previous rises in coffee, rubber, cotton, and sugar prices. With the rise in price, production increased, then prices fell. Conditions became more and more unstable, and land kept changing hands. The era of beggar millionaires began as plantation pioneers yielded to exporters who took over the lands for payment of debts. In barely 3 years, from 1959 to 1961, to give but one example, the international price of the Brazilian cacao bean fell by 1/3. Since then, the tendency to rise has opened the door of hope a crack, but the United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America predicts a short life for the upward curve. To keep their chocolate cheap, the big cacao consumers, the United States, Britain, West Germany, Holland, France, stimulate competition between African cacao and cacao. My Chinese is messing with me. From Brazil and Ecuador. Controlling prices as they do, these nations bring on periods of depression which put cacao workers back on the road. The unemployed look for trees to sleep under and green bananas to fool their stomachs. One product they certainly don't eat is the fine chocolate that Brazil actually imports from France and Switzerland. Chocolate costs more and more, cocoa less and less. Between 1950 and 1960, Ecuador's cacao sales rose more than 30% in volume, but only 15% in value. I know I must have pronounced it right at some point. The remaining 15% was a gift from Ecuador to those rich countries which, in the same period, sent it their industrial products at escalating prices. Ecuador's economy depends on the sale of bananas, coffee, cocoa, three food products highly subject to price fluctuations. According to official data, 7 of every 10 Ecuadorians suffer from basic malnutrition, and the country has one of the highest death rates in the world. Cheap hands for cotton. Brazil is the 4th largest cotton producing country, Mexico the 5th. More than 1/5 of all cotton consumed by the world's textile industries comes from Latin America. At the end of the 18th century, cotton had become the most important industrial raw material in Europe. England multiplied its purchases of the fiber by 5 in 30 years. The spinning frame invented by Arkwright at the same time that Watt was patenting his steam engine, and Cartwright's later development of the mechanical loom gave textile manufacturing a decisive push and provided the cotton plant with eager overseas markets. Cotton euphoria brusquely awakened the port of São Luís do Maranhão from a long tropical siesta previously interrupted only by the arrival of a couple of ships a year. Now black slaves streamed onto the North Brazilian plantations, and some 200 ships a year carrying 1,000,000 pounds of raw cotton sailed from São Luís. The economic crisis in mining at the beginning of the 19th century gave cotton an abundance of slave labor. With the exhaustion of the gold and diamond supply in the south, Brazil seemed to revive in the north. The port flourished, producing enough poets to become known as the Athens of Brazil. But since no one in the Maranhão region bothered to raise food, hunger entered along with prosperity. Sometimes there was only rice to eat. The story ended as it had begun. Suddenly, large-scale cotton production on southern United States plantations, which had better soil and machines for cleaning and baling, lowered prices by 2/3, and Brazil dropped out of the race. Prosperity returned when the Civil War interrupted U.S. supplies, but did not last long. Between 1934 and 1939, Brazilian cotton production grew impressively from 125,000 to more than 320,000 tons. Then the United States flooded the world market with its surpluses and prices slumped again. The United States agricultural surpluses are, as we know, the result of fat subsidies to its producers. It spills the surpluses out across the world at dumping prices as part of its foreign aid program. Cotton was Paraguay's chief export until the ruinous competition of U.S. cotton displaced it in the market, and Paraguayan production has fallen by 50% since 1952. In the same way, Uruguay lost the Canadian market for its rice and the wheat of Argentina once the world's granary virtually vanished from international markets. The United States' dumping of cotton has not affected the imperial hold of a U.S. firm, Anderson, Clayton and Co., over this product in Latin America or interfere with U.S. purchases through the firm of Mexican cotton for resale to other countries. World trade of Latin American cotton nevertheless remains lively thanks to its extremely low production costs. Even reality concealing official figures betray the wretched standards of pay for actual work. In Brazil, it is done either for hunger wages or on a serf basis. In Guatemala, plantation owners boast of paying 19 quetzals, about $10 a month, most of it in kind at prices they themselves determined. Mexican migrant workers moving from harvest to harvest at $1.50 a day suffer from underemployment and consequent undernutrition. The lot of Nicaraguan cotton workers is much worse, and Salvadorans who supply cotton to Japanese textile industries consume fewer calories and proteins than the hungry peasants of India. In Peru's economy, cotton is the second agricultural source of foreign currency. Jose Carlos Mariátegui has noted how foreign capitalism, in its constant search for land, labor, and markets, came to control Peru's export crops by foreclosing the mortgages of debt-delinquent landowners. When General Velasco Alvarado's nationalist government came to power in 1968, less than one-sixth of land suitable for intensive cultivation was being used. Per capita income was 15 times less than in the United States, and consumption of calories was among the world's lowest. But cotton production, like sugar, was still dictated by the same non-Peruvian criteria exposed by Mariátegui. The best lands, those along the coast, belonged to U.S. enterprises or to landlords who, like the Lima bourgeois, were only nationals in geographical sense. 5 big concerns, 2 of which, Anderson, Clayton, and Grace, are based in the United States, dominated the export of cotton and sugar and also produced them in their own agro-industrial complexes. Coastal sugar and cotton plantations, supposedly centers of prosperity and progress in contrast to Sierra latifundios, paid hunger wages until 1969 agrarian reform expropriated them and handed them over to the workers as cooperatives. According to the Inter-American Committee for Agricultural Development, the income for each member of a coastal workers' family amounted to a mere $5 a month. With 30 affiliates in Latin America, Anderson Clayton has a monopoly. It not only sells cotton, but its network controls the financing and industrialization of the fiber and its derivatives, and also produces food on a large scale. In Mexico, for example, while the company owns no land, it still dominates cotton production, and the 800,000 Mexicans who harvest the crop are in fact at its mercy. It buys the excellent Mexican cotton at a very low price, having previously extended credits to producers on the condition that they sell it at the price with which it opens the market. In addition to advancing money, it supplies fertilizer, seeds, and insecticides. It reserves the right to supervise the application of fertilizer, the sowing, and the harvesting. It fixes its own price for ginning the cotton and uses the seeds in its oil, fat, and margarine factories. In recent years, the firm, not content with dominating the cotton business, has even broken into the candy and chocolate fields. Recently buying the well-known firm Luxus. Anderson Clayton is also involved in coffee and is the chief exporter of Brazilian coffee. It first took an interest in that business in 1950, and 3 years later it had dethroned the American Coffee Corporation. It is also the top producer of Brazilian foodstuffs and is one of the country's 35 most powerful firms. Cheap hands for coffee. Some people rank coffee almost on a par with oil in its importance on the international market. At the beginning of the 1950s, Latin America was supplying 4/5 of the coffee the world consumed. Since then, the competition of robust African coffee, lower in quality but also in price, has reduced Latin America's share. Nevertheless, 1/6 of the currency the region obtains abroad now comes from coffee. Its price fluctuations affect 15 countries south of the Rio Grande. Brazil is the world's top producer, getting about half of its export income from coffee. El Salvador, Guatemala, Costa Rica, and Haiti also largely depend on coffee, and it accounts for 2/3 of Colombia's foreign exchange. Coffee brought inflation to Brazil. Between 1824 and 1854, the price of a man doubled. At that figure, and with their prosperous days, and with their prosperous days, a thing of the past, neither the North's cotton producers nor the Northeast sugar producers could afford slaves. Brazil's center of gravity moved south. In addition to slave labor, the coffee producers used European immigrants who brought in 50% of the harvest in a sharecropping setup that still prevails in Brazil's interior. Today, tourists who drive through the woods for a swim at Tijuca Beach are unaware that there in the mountains surrounding Rio de Janeiro, big coffee plantations existed more than a century ago. Flanking the Sierra, these plantations spread toward the state of Sao Paulo in their endless pursuit of the hummus of virgin lands. Toward the end of the century, coffee planters, by then the new Brazilian social elite, sharpened their pencils and totted up their accounts. Subsistence wages worked out cheaper than the purchase and maintenance of increasingly scarce slaves. With the abolition of slavery in 1888, the combined forms of feudal serfdom and wage labor that still persist were inaugurated. From then on, an army of free farmhands would accompany coffee on its travels. The Rio Paraíba became the country's richest area, to be quickly ruined by a plant whose destructive form of cultivation left forests razed, natural reserves exhausted, and general decadence in its wake. Previously, virgin lands were pitilessly eroded as the plunder march of coffee advanced, weakening the plants and making them vulnerable to diseases. The coffee plantation invaded the broad purple plateau west of Sao Paulo, converting it into a sea of coffee, with slightly less crude farming methods and continued advancing westward. It reached the banks of the Parana, where, facing the Mato Grosso savannas, it turned south. In recent years, it has again moved west along the Paraguayan border. Today, Sao Paulo is the most developed state in Brazil, containing the country's industrial center, but its coffee plantations still teem with vassal inhabitants who pay rent for their land with their and their children's toil. In the prosperous post-World War I years, the coffee growers' voracity virtually ended the system under which plantation workers could grow food crops on their own. Now they can only do it by paying rent in the form of wages labor. The latifundista also uses contractual sharecroppers who are allowed to raise seasonal crops in return for planting still more coffee trees for his benefit. 4 years after planting, when the branches are yellow with beans, the land has multiplied in value and it is time for the sharecropper to move on. Coffee plantations pay even less in Guatemala than cotton plantations. On the southern slopes, the owners claim to pay $15 a month to the thousands of natives who descend southward each year from the Altiplano to sell their labor during the harvest. The plantations have private police forces there, as the popular saying has it, a man is cheaper than a mule, and the repressive apparatus sees that he remains so. In the Alta Verapaz region, the situation is even worse. The planters have no trucks or carts. They do not need them since it costs less to use the Indians' backs. Coffee is basic to the economy of El Salvador, a little country owned by a handful of oligarchical families. Monoculture makes it necessary to import the beans, people's only source of protein, corn, vegetables, and other foods the country traditionally produced. A quarter of all Salvadorians die of avitaminosis, or severe vitamin deficiency. As for Haiti, it has Latin America's highest death rate, and more than half of its children are anemic. The wages Haiti requires by law belong in the Department of Science Fiction. Actual wages on coffee plantation vary from 7 cents to 15 cents a day. In Colombia, where suitable slopes abound, coffee is king. According to a Time magazine report in 1962, only 5% of the price yielded by coffee in its journey from tree to U.S. consumer goes into the wages of the workers who produce it. In contrast to Brazil, most Colombian coffee is produced not by latifundios, but by minifundios, small farms which tend to become increasingly smaller and smaller. Between 1955 and 1960, 100,000 new plantations appeared, most of them minute, less than 1 hectare. Small and very small farmers produce 3/4 of the coffee exported by Colombia, and 96% of the plantations are minifundios. Juan Valdez smiles in the ads, but in fact, atomization of the land is steadily forcing his living standards down and making it easier for the Federación Nacional de Cafeteros, which represents the big landowners and virtually monopolizes trade in the product, to manipulate the situation. Farms of less than a hectare produce starvation incomes, an average of $130 a year.